Hi everyone, and good evening and welcome to our webinar, How to Feed the Veteran Horse. I have my colleagues with me this evening, Tracy Hammond and Claire Akers, so between us we'll be answering questions in the background whilst the others are doing their talk. So we're not going to do questions at the end. If you do have any questions that we don't manage to cover, if you put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, we can retrieve them from this evening, the recording, etc., and we'll answer them tomorrow, or you can actually just email or contact the feed line tomorrow if you have specific inquiries. So needless to say, there is a lot of ground to cover. We're trying to keep it concise, so it could be anywhere between half an hour and 60 minutes, depending on how carried away we get talking about our topics. I'm Katie Williams, I'm the technical manager at Dengie, and as I mentioned, I've got Tracy Hammond and Claire Akers, who are both long-standing members of the nutrition team joining me this evening. So we're each going to do a section, but if you just bear with me, I will share the screen and we'll get started. There we go. Okay, so just to set the scene a little bit, there are three sort of areas we're going to cover, and they really are the sort of most commonly asked questions that we receive on the Dengie feed line relating to veterans specifically. Now, obviously they overlap with other types of horses, but they are often very specific to the veteran. So I'm going to start off with looking at weight loss or how to avoid it. I'll be followed by Tracy, who's going to cover what to feed a horse with PPID, and then Claire has bravely taken on the alternative forages for those with poor dentition subject, and we're going to probably overlap a little bit, Claire and I, so we'll possibly cover the same ground, but Claire's got some brilliant case studies to share with you that will put all of the information we're going to give you into practice. So just to set the scene a little bit more, what is a veteran? Well, it's really the physiological age these days as opposed to chronological. So old age has been defined in the past at the point at which you only have 25% of the population still alive. But age is just a number. So the sort of experiences, the wear and tear and the care with which a particular horse has been treated can have a really big impact on how well they actually age and deal with getting older. So in the late 90s, one study actually found that 15 years was around the point at which 25% of the horse population was still alive. I think since then, with better veterinary care and better management and knowledge, we're probably looking at something in the region of 20 plus years now, and I think most of us would expect, if we look after our horses well, for them to get well into their late 20s and possibly the 30s, and obviously with ponies they can live longer than that as well. So we do have an ageing population in horses just as we do in humans, and that's why we get the frequency of calls relating to older horses that we do. So why do older horses lose weight? Well, this physiological aging process, we believe that there are certain elements of the digestive system that tend to become less efficient as a result of the cumulative effects of life. Now, the care and attention that a horse experiences throughout its life will have a big bearing on this, but fundamentally there are some things that will change eventually with time. Poor dentition, we know that most horses are going to have around 50% of their forage ration, certainly in the winter months, made up of conserved forages, and as they get older, if they can't chew it because their dentition has been compromised in some way, whether it's loose or wobbly teeth or very worn teeth, if it's half of their diet that they're no longer able to eat very efficiently, then it can have a massive impact on their ability to hold their weight. You imagine if you couldn't eat half of your daily ration very easily, or it took you a lot longer, and then the sort of impact on your weight would be quite dramatic. And it's the same with the horse. If we put fibre in front of them that they can manage to eat, it can make all the difference between a horse that's chronically underweight or something that's in good condition. Now, that reduction in fibre intake can actually alter the microbial population in the gut, especially if it's over a prolonged period of time, and that ultimately will also have an impact on gut health, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. one of the key concepts really for older horses is that the end product of fibre fermentation in the gut, it provides an energy source that the horse can utilise, but it's also the energy source specifically of the cells in the gut, so the colonocytes. And it is that reduction in fibre and therefore the production of butyrate that can really start to impact on gut health, because if those cells lining the gut aren't as healthy as they should be, they can actually become more leaky, and we refer to it as leaky gut syndrome. And that can allow pathogenic substances, bacteria, all sorts of things from the gut that shouldn't go through the gut wall, because these cells have become less efficient and the gut's leakier, they can start to cause problems in the horse. So they're all things that we need to think about when we're managing the older horse. So are older horses actually becoming less efficient at digesting and absorbing food? Well, early research suggested that horses over 20 years had reduced protein, phosphorus and fibre digestibilities. This was actually work done in America. Later work has sort of shown that really, if you look after your horse, as we've said, regular dental attention, worming, etc., there actually is often very little difference in their ability to digest and absorb food. And they compared adults horses within the ranges of 5 to 12 years with those that we perhaps consider older or veterans of 19 to 28, and found very little difference between the two. So again, the key is, and obviously, if we're buying our horses when they're older, we can't sort of control, and we have no way of knowing how well they were looked after as a 5-year-old perhaps. But if we are lucky enough to have them when they're young, or breed them ourselves, and we know that we've looked after them well throughout their lifetime, then really they're probably just as efficient and capable of digesting, absorbing food as a younger horse, until we obviously see signs of things going wrong. And these are some of the clinical signs that you might see. And if you've got these issues apparent, then yes, it is a good indicator that something has gone awry in the gut. So things like colic, inflammatory bowel disease, and latterly we seem to be seeing an increase in a phenomenon called free fecal water, where the horse actually passes normal droppings, but then liquid follows, and not diarrhea, it's very distinct normal droppings followed by this sort of fecal water. So all of those are potential indicators of problems, and tend to be more common in older horses. You may also see some mild recurrent colic. That's a fairly common sign or symptom of IBD. But in some cases, acute severe colic episodes can actually occur as well. Now, again, there's some sort of recent work coming out, I've put the reference there, Vitali 2021, that is actually showing that when we have these sort of allergic or immune responses, it's more immune response to some issue going on in the gut, and something that's triggered this immune reaction, the end products of that immune reaction can actually start to block the gut tissue in the small intestine. Now that is actually stopping the absorption of nutrients that we'd normally expect to be absorbed in the small intestine, so things like proteins, fats and oils, and some of our carbohydrates, things like starch. If they have been cooked to make them more digestible, they should be being absorbed in that small intestine. But because the intestinal tissue is this sort of clogged up with these if the sort of end products of the immune response, it means that those nutrients are passing through to the hindgut. And as I'm sure you can imagine, if same principle we see with things like laminitis, if starch and nutrients are not being absorbed in the small intestine, they pass through the gut, end up in the hindgut, and they can cause real problems there. And it may be things like excessive fermentation. And I've started to hear of a few instances where this is ringing a few bells as to what might be going on. So horses that are very gassy, having been out to grass, and not very comfortable in their gut, and perhaps not very generally very happy, quite stressy individuals. And whilst it's a bit of a leap at this stage to conclude that this might be the problem, there are some indications going on that might be what we're dealing with here. So new studies coming out all the time, and obviously inflammatory bowel disease is being researched in humans and other species, and I think we'll find out more in the years to come and how best to sort of treat and manage it. So So what can we do to promote gut health? Well, there are microbes present throughout the whole of the digestive tract. The horse is reliant on them for breaking down fibre. That's the function that we're most familiar with. They're also part of the immune system as well, and they can help to regulate acidity. So what we'd call things like lactic acid utilising bacteria actually gobble up some of the stronger acids produced from digesting feed ingredients, and they help to regulate acidity in the gut. Now, I think it's important to point out at this stage that there are no live bacteria probiotics approved for horses. I think this is a really important point because people do look for bacterial probiotics, and if they are out there and you are accessing them, then they're basically an illegal product. Now, it gets, without getting too complicated about feed additives, rules and regulations, there are bacteria approved for horses, but as silage additives, so they should not be being used in probiotic substances or supplements. What is approved is live yeast, and this is a fungi, and it actually helps to improve fibre digestion by breaking the fibrous structure for the bacteria that then come along to ferment it. And the best sort of analogy I can use is it's basically like your mum and dad cutting up your food when you're a child for you. They're starting that prep to make it a lot easier for you to eat and break down, and all you've got to do is basically get it into your mouth and gobble it up, and that's the way the fungi work to help the bacteria. And if you stimulate the fungi, then you help the fibre digestion, and everything becomes a lot more efficient. So in the context of the older horse that is underweight, or we're trying to reduce the risk of weight loss, everything we can do to help them get more out of the forage and the fibrous part of the diet reduces reliance on other things like cereal-based feeds. And we know for any horse, the risk of using cereals is that you're increasing acidity, and things like ulcers and colic and laminitis are associated with that. So yes, in moderation it's fine, but the less reliance we have on them, and the more we can utilise good quality fibre and get the most out of it, the healthier the horse will generally be. We also have this group of substances called prebiotics. Now, again, pre and biotic basically means it acts on the bacteria in the gut. It's not a live product, so it's a feed material rather than a feed additive. And we use them in feeds and supplements quite regularly. There are different varieties. The ones that we tend to favour are the short chain FOS prebiotics, and they are the ones that act as a food source for bacteria in the gut. So again, to sort of give you an analogy, it's like feeding your troops. If your bacteria are your fibre digesters and they're your immune system or part of it in the horse, if we can feed them and keep them well fed and so they proliferate, they work by a process called competitive exclusion. So if the good guys are there in lots of numbers, they'll keep the bad ones at bay. So again, this whole sort of premise of trying to keep the bacterial population healthy and the gut healthy ultimately keeps the horse healthy too. So as I say, they're not live prebiotics, they just act on the bacteria in the actual digestive system. So this is where Claire and I will overlap a little bit, but just want to give you some data that we did. It's a study from a few years ago now, but it just goes to show the challenges when we have poor dentition. Now, it was a Dengie funded study with a student from Bristol College, and she compared hay, short chopped fibre, so in this case it was a combination of grass and alfalfa, and then a soaked fibre source, which was a combination of alfalfa and sugar beets. And with those horses that had poor dentition, so it's done at a rescue sanctuary, so there was a group of older horses with poor dentition and then a group with normal dentition or relatively normal. On 44% of occasions, the horses with the poor dentition refused hay completely. They just don't even bother trying to eat it. On 6%, they refused the short chop, but nobody refused the soaked fibre mash. And interestingly, for those that did manage hay, they consumed about 2/3 less than the horses with a normal dentition in the same time period. And we do need to bear this in mind if we are going to put our older horses out in groups with perhaps younger animals or animals with normal dentition, that the older one, if you allow them free choice access to forage, it's the older ones or those with poor dentition that are going to be consuming less. So if the others are gobbling it all up, and they're missing out because they just can't eat it quickly enough, that can again contribute to weight loss. So you do just need to be aware of that, and might not always be the most practical thing to do, but if you can bring them away from a herd and allow them time to eat their own forage allocation, so you know they're getting what they need, that can be a really effective strategy for just making sure they maintain their weight and condition. But hopefully that will set the scene a little bit more for what Claire's going to talk about. She'll focus on poor dentition in a lot more detail. So when we look at forage, the quality is so important for the older horse. The first thing is finding it or providing it in a form that they can actually manage. So if you have to go to the extreme of using a mash, so be it. And you can, for lots of horses, keep them going for a very long time if they can manage grass and then a sort of soaked mash in the bucket to replace your hay. We often find that weight loss occurs when the horses move off of pasture. So this time of year, actually, the clocks have just changed. People tend to switch from perhaps turning out overnight or leaving them out all the time to bringing them in overnight, or maybe just longer periods when they're stabled. And there's greater reliance on these conserved forages. And that fundamental difference is that pasture is obviously grass. It has a high sort of moisture content, but it's also got a high digestibility. It's very, or much easier for the horse to break down and digest compared to the conserved forages. When we conserve forage, we let it go to maturity, then we harvest it, and that indigestible material is much higher in those conserved forages. And it's often when we make that transition that the older horse starts to lose weight, because they just can't chew it as efficiently, and the whole of the digestive process starts to become less efficient. So if they can still manage that longer length forage, they can physically chew it okay, then that's great, but we are still trying to look for the most digestible one we can. So typically, those that are harvested earlier in the season will be the more digestible sources of forage. So if you handle it and it feels soft and leafy, and it looks nice and green and leafy, then it's likely to be more digestible. Okay, it tends to be the coarse, fibrous ones that are harvested later and tend to be less digestible. Now, it won't necessarily tell you what the actual energy or the sugar content and all of those sorts of parameters are, but digestibility is key. So the softer, the leafier, the easier it is for the horse to break down, the more likely it is that they will do better on it. So they're the ones to go for your older horses if you can. And that will then, as I say, reduce the reliance, hopefully, on the bucket feed, because the more they can get from the forage, the healthier and better they will do. Now, if we have to go to the bucket feed as the forage source, then something like this soaked mash, alpha beet, that sort of equivalent product can be used as a complete or partial hay replacer, and I'm not going to preempt what Claire's saying any more than that, but it can perform a function in the bucket feed as the sort of extra calories, as well as a partial or complete hay replacer too. Now, for general health, it's recommended in all horses that we keep the level of starch to a minimum, and the guidance really to reduce the risk of ulcers is no more than 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal and 2 grams per kilo body weight per day. And we do have a starch calculator on our website, so do look for that if you want to work out what your horse is consuming. You just need the amount you're feeding and the starch level in the feeds you're using, and it will do all the maths for you and tell you whether it's too high or too low, or not too low, but low enough. So when we're looking at the bucket feed, again, if we can apply the principle of good quality fibres first, then great. So things like alfalfa and grass chops contain highly digestible fibre. They're harvested when they're young, in contrast to the hay that we're making. And then combining that with something like sugar beet, which is a highly digestible fibre source. The sugar beet also has a prebiotic-like effect in the gut. So in studies that, again, Dengie funded many years ago now, Dr. Gemma Murray did the study for us, and she actually utilised sugar beet alongside other fibres and found that when you put the sugar beet in, the digestibility of the other fibres improved as well. So it has that prebiotic-like effect. You can then also add high oil feeds. Now, oil is very energy dense, so it is providing a lot of calories in a relatively small volume of feed, which can be useful if the horse has poor teeth. And obviously the starch content tends to be low as well, so we're not increasing the risk of ulcers and colic. And if you're using them, then things like micronized linseed alongside the alpha beet, they are actually straight feeds, so you'd need to add just a balance or a supplement alongside. If you need more than that, so we've gone with the fibre and oil-based ration, we've balanced it out with a supplement or a balancer. In some cases, this chopped fibre may be just sort of too much chewing for the horse. So we have the pelleted versions, which can be fed dampened or soaked. So if they can't manage alfre oil or something like that, which is one of our highest calorie feeds, then we can add in or go to using things like alfalfa pellets, which can be soaked if they need to be. Because it's pelleted, it's much denser, so the horse hasn't actually got to spend quite so long eating. Now, normally we want to encourage more chewing and more chew time, but for those that are taking a long time to eat already, we actually, the sort of mission really is to try and provide something that they can actually manage and get enough of in the period of time that they can actually spend eating. Obviously, small frequent meals is really important. So if you can do it yourself in the middle of the day or late at night, that's great. Maybe sort of talk to other people on the yard, see if they could pop a feed in for you last thing. As soon as we're getting meals bigger than 1.5 kilos, 1.75 kilos maybe, for a bigger horse, we're starting to sort of compromise the digestion and potentially risk digestive upset. So 3 or 4 small meals throughout the day is much better. I just wanted to touch on this before I sort of hand over to Tracy. Now, I mentioned the free fecal water and some of the digestive upsets, and this is just an area that I think is receiving increased attention. So it was first of all called Transfusions, which I think is the best name ever for it. It tickles my sense of humour, but it's also called fecal transfer, or in some cases fecal microbial transfer. And effectively, when you've got a chronic gastrointestinal problem, there's increasing evidence to show that transferring fecal material, so in other words, you're taking the good bugs from a healthy animal, healthy donor animal, and you're putting them into the horse that maybe has a chronic sort of free fecal water or IBD problem. Now, it's being utilised in humans with a lot of success in humans of all sorts of ages that have IBD, but I think the veteran horse is probably where this is going to be most likely to show some sort of significant results. So there are a few vets starting to do it. The protocols and how to go about it are still a bit sketchy, but if you do have a veteran with a chronic sort of loose droppings, diarrhea, or this free fecal water, it certainly is something to consider and bear in mind, and see if you can talk to your vet about it. I was watching a webinar actually at the weekend, and it was very much in the context of humans, but there have been some sort of, should we say, conflicting effectiveness of results with doing this strategy. And one of the researchers made a really valid point, which I thought was pertinent to tonight's topic. They were saying that repeated treatments may well be necessary, especially if this is a chronic problem and that the cause isn't going away. And if it is just a fact of old age, which isn't going to go away, you can't get any younger, then it may be that we actually do need to repeat this transfusion or fecal transfer to actually have an impact and make a difference for the animal for the longer term. And I also thought it was really interesting that they're testing it in other species that suffer with IBD, and apparently dolphins are one of those species that suffer with it as well. So there's clearly a sort of a common thread, if you like, across different species, that we're so dependent on microbial populations that anything that disrupts that, whether it's stress or diet or whatever it might be, that these strategies for trying to deal with it, the principles apply to whatever species. So just thought that was some interesting information. And if anyone does have issues with horses, long-term sort of chronic diarrhea problems, do get in touch, because it is an area we can make some suggestions for, but we need a lot more detail about the individual horse to give a good recommendation, really. So my take-home messages for my section, really: grazing, it is the most digestible source of the fibre. So for these horses that may be prone to weight loss, or we're really working hard to try and reduce the risk of weight loss, then pasture is the best form of fibre, if assuming they're not laminitic, etc. Forage as digestible as possible. Get that early cut if you can. Put it into a form that they can choose. If they can't manage the long length forage, your next step is a short chop. And then if they can no longer manage that, we're going down to pelleted forms of fibre, which can be soaked and made into a mash. And just think about, particularly this time of year, when we change from that sort of digestible grass and pasture onto indigestible hay, that is the sort of key time when we're most at risk of things like colic and potentially the weight loss problem begins. In the bucket feed, use those highly digestible fibres, so things like alfalfa and sugar beet, and then top up with oil and maybe add in some micronized linseed. If you do need more than that, then the key is to find as lower starch options as possible. Small frequent meals, especially if you are going to use any cereal-based feed, and do consider those digestive aids, particularly the yeast and the prebiotics. They will help fibre digestion and promote good gut health as well. So that's my section. I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to talk to you about feeding horses with PPID. So I'll just approve her to take ownership of that. And I will.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Katie. It seems to be working, which is a relief. So I am talking about feeding the PPID horse or pony, and I felt that probably one of the easiest ways I could talk about that was actually to talk a little bit about my own pony, Kizzy. So meet Kizzy. This is her. She is truly geriatric, and by that I mean that she is an OAP and she has numerous health issues as well as unfortunately that affect her. So she's got additional problems like arthritis. She does have free fecal water. It tends to be only occasionally with her, and most frequently it's when the hay is perhaps a bit coarse and perhaps her teeth don't cope with it as well. She has diastema, which are gaps between her teeth, which means I can no longer feed her chopped fibre. She does have cataract as well, and obviously most relevant to this, she has PPID and equine metabolic syndrome as well, which unfortunately makes her very laminitis prone. She is 31 years old. We think she could actually be older. She was purchased by a previous owner in 2004 and then came to live with me in 2013 to live out her days. So she does have many problems, and probably many of you are dealing with horses and ponies that don't just have one singular issue. And I think that's the thing about dealing with these veterans, is you're often dealing with more than one thing at once. You can't always get everything perfect. But despite all of these problems, she's still a very cheery little pony. She has lots of joie de vie and is full of cheek. So she's living kind of partly her best retirement years. Let's see if I still click on. So in terms of feeding to manage laminitis risk, I could probably talk for some hours about this subject, and we're supposed to be being a little bit speedy this evening. So I did actually do a webinar earlier on in the year in conjunction with Lip Hook, and that is available on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't already seen that, I would say to go and have a look, because there's lots of really useful information and advice on there. I would say one of the things I would say is get your horse or pony tested. If it's offered as part of an OAP kind of package by your veterinary surgery, it's a really good thing to know if there is that risk there. And in terms of managing the kind of potential risk of laminitis in association with PPID, as with really any horse that's at risk of laminitis, there are two main things that we're actually going to do. We're going to manage the intake of sugar and starch, and we're going to keep the horse or pony at a healthy weight as well. So in terms of managing a sugar and starch intake, grazing and forage will always make up the greatest proportion of sugar or starch intake in any horse or pony's diet, unless they're fed a crazy amount of cereals, which is unlikely in our kind of population of horses that we're talking about now. So it is the grass and forage that will need to be managed, whether that's reducing kind of things like strip grazing, kind of muzzle use, managing the total intake of forage or soaking the forage. There's lots of different things that we can do like that. But because we're at the time of year that we're at the moment, one piece of advice that I did want to give was with regard to frosty grass, because I hear all sorts of information on the feed line from people telling me they've been told this or that, and they're a bit confused with regards to what's going on there and laminitis risk. So when we think about kind of grass sugar production, for ease of conversation, when it's daylight and the sun is shining, the plant will photosynthesize and sugars will be produced kind of in the grass, and those levels will increase throughout the day with sunshine and be stored away. At night time, when it's dark, the plant can't photosynthesize, and instead it respires, and it has to use those sugar levels kind of up in order to keep growing. Now, with frosty kind of conditions, when the temperatures overnight dip below 5 degrees C, the grass doesn't actually grow. When then it's frosty in the morning, the grass is definitely not growing because it's even colder, and the sun might still be shining. And with that kind of daylight or that sunshine, again, we're getting a rise in the amount of sugar production. But because if the overnight temperatures are still very low, so less than 5 degrees, the grass can't actually grow. So those sugar levels just get higher and higher. So for those with PPID that are prone to laminitis, perhaps because they've also got insulin dysregulation, this time of year through the winter months and into the early spring with frosty conditions can actually be quite risky for them. And if you have an individual that's particularly prone to laminitis, it may be better to remove them from pasture under those conditions. In terms of when it is kind of suitable to turn out again, then generally we would advise that overnight conditions need to be above 5 degrees again, and then perhaps kind of cloudy during the daytime as well for those levels to drop, for perhaps it to be a little bit more appropriate kind of at that later time. But this is really going to require a lot of kind of monitoring and knowing your kind of horse or pony and their individual kind of laminitis risk as well. But just to summarise, it's really that kind of frosty conditions combined with sunlight are risky time, and you need overnight temperatures to be above 5 degrees again for it then to be more appropriate to consider some turnout. There we go. With regards to maintaining at a healthy weight, I'd just like to go back one, Katie, if you've got control of the talk. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. But with regards to kind of managing weight, going the wrong way a bit. Lovely, thank you, Katie. With regards to managing weight, there are just as many older horses and ponies with PPID that are poor doers, as well as those that are good doers, and they often obviously require different types of managements. So for our good doers, we're going to be thinking about restricting grass and also doing a managed forage intake. So we'll perhaps be limiting the total amount that they have to consume, but that doesn't mean that the nutrition is any the less important to them, and we will still be balancing that diet. When it comes to kind of types of forage for the good doers, just feeding back to Katie's talk, we're obviously looking for those that are less digestible so that hopefully they can have more of them, whether it is in the long chop format or a soaked format, which Claire will talk about later. For the poor doers, what I often find is people are very frightened to kind of feed them because they are worried about that laminitis risk. But for the poor doers, we really do need to feed them. We may still be doing things like soaking their forage, for example, and managing their access to grass from the point of view of managing their sugar intake. But when it comes to forage, we'll probably be feeding much more kind of ad lib quantities just to try and make sure they get sufficient calories from their forage ration. When it comes to the bucket feed, we'll then be looking for kind of lower sugar and starch sources of feedstuff. So things like alfalfa and unmolashed sugar beet. We've added oil for extra calories, plus the ration being balanced. And Katie mentioned many of those types of feeds in her talk previously, but they would all be much more digestible, much more calorific, and really useful kind of for the poor doer. And I'll pick up again on that in a moment. The only way we're really going to know whether our horse is too thin or too fat is to monitor their weight and fat score kind of very regularly. And just one of the other things that I would say be aware of is be aware of a thick hairy coat, because it can hide a multitude of sins. And even for Kizzy, you know, I clip her in the opposite time of the year to anybody else because I usually clip around June, but as soon as I clip her, people go, oh, doesn't she look lean? She's not changed weight, she's just lost her coat. So beware kind of a thick hairy coat, it can hide some sins. Moving on to the next slide. So this was Kizzy. She definitely fell into the good doer camp when she was first diagnosed with laminitis, unfortunately with her previous owner back in 2010. At that stage she was very overweight, and over a period of years we've worked on getting her to a healthier weight. So the August 10 picture was still with her previous owner, and then the bottom two were subsequent to her joining me. And you can see over that period of time she has progressively lost weight and been leaner. Now you may be looking at the June 19 picture thinking, well, she does look really quite lean there, and what I would say is I am happy with her weight at that stage, because that is when she is most comfortable on her feet and she's otherwise generally healthy. So yes, there are some ribs there, she is a little bit leaner, but for her I consider that a healthy weight because she's healthiest at that condition. But as I say, not all horses are as kind of good doers like Kizzy. There are plenty with PPID that aren't. And on the next slide is Ella. And I met Ella's lovely owner actually at a client evening in the stage where we were still able to see people face to face. And she said to me that she'd got concerns with regards to Ella. She'd suddenly lost lots of weight and muscle pre-winter, and then a routine blood test identified PPID. So I gave her some remote kind of feeding advice, and she sent me a picture of Ella at that time. And the ration I recommended for Ella, because she was lean, because she needed to gain both weight and muscle, was actually a combination of healthy tummy, alpha beet, and some micronized linseed as well. And probably healthy tummy isn't the first thing that might spring to mind to recommend, but there's just a lot of things in that product that as a full package are actually really useful for veterans that are struggling to maintain condition. A few months down the line, kind of post-winter into spring, early summer, Ella's owner contacted me again and said, oh, I think Ella might start to be looking a little bit too well now. Do we need to adjust the ration? And in the picture on the next slide, you can see that she actually is looking well, and she's starting to verge on the looking too well. So we certainly did need to make some adjustments again to her diet and ration to keep her at a healthy weight. So for some individuals, you know, we do need that dietary change. We do need to feed them more calories, and then need to continue to monitor them to make sure that they maintain that healthy condition. Moving on to the next slide, one of the other things that we struggle with sometimes with horses with PPID is fussiness. And quite commonly, I tend to hear people say this most perhaps when their horse is first medicated. It can be a particular issue. And even today on the feed line, I have spoken to numerous people who have reported that this is actually the case, and they're struggling to get them to eat. Kizzy was the same. When she was first medicated, she actually went on and off different kind of feeds, and her forage as well. So sometimes she'd eat her bucket feed, sometimes she'd prefer a forage, and it was the other way around. For her, actually, it was really handy because at that time we were just developing hi-fi molasses free, and she found that really tasty. So that was pre that product being launched, so quite a while ago now. When it comes to dealing or managing with fussiness, bear with it. It does get better kind of from experience, but until it does, there are a few things that we can do. So we can offer feeds in what we describe as cafeteria style, as described in, or as shown, sorry, in that picture there. And what we mean by that is actually offering different feeds in different buckets. So separating out your different feedstuffs that you have and would normally offer your horse or pony, putting them in different buckets, and then seeing which one they find most acceptable or palatable and consume most of. It won't necessarily be the same one every day, but overall, by having them in different buckets and encouraging some foraging behaviour, they may just consume that little bit more. And sometimes be prepared to actually use a type of feed that may not be the perfect choice. So if you have kind of laminitis concerns, you may obviously steer clear of cereals and molasses and things like that in very large amounts. But actually a little bit of these things can be tasty, especially if you're trying to get medication in to them as well. So if it's just in small quantities, something that isn't always the perfect choice can just be a little bit useful to tempting them to eat something that may be better for them or more appropriate for them. But as I say, just bear with it. From my experience, it does get better kind of over a period of time, and we just need to find something that they actually like. So one of the other things that we need to consider is a balanced diet. So this is important for any horse or pony to have a balanced diet throughout their lifetime. But for those with PPID, they can be more susceptible to infections. So ensuring that they have adequate antioxidants, so things like vitamin E and selenium, is particularly important for supporting their immune system or immune function. So we definitely want to ensure a balanced diet. Not only that, there are those with PPID that will lose weight and significant amounts of muscle, and for those individuals we want to make sure they have both sufficient energy and sufficient kind of protein in their diet. In addition, there may be some individuals like Kizzy where I was having to restrict her total intake and she doesn't actually have grass access either, which means her diet is really restricted. Some of those nutrient deficiencies then become much worse, so we definitely need to balance the ration. Now, we use a ration evaluation program here at Dengie called PC Horse, and it's a really useful program because we can input all of the information about the horse, we can input their kind of current grass and forage, plus any additional feeds that they're having, to do all the calculations and sums for us to tell us how balanced that ration is. The diets that I've put in here are kind of the same, but one has an added balancer and the other lacks the balancer. So anything in red is below kind of the optimal requirements. So you can see on the left, the ration where the horse is just on 6 hours of poor pasture and a restricted amount of hay, there are multiple nutrients that are lacking. And, you know, certainly for one of those ones there is lysine, which is one of our essential amino acids or building block of protein. If you've got a horse that's losing muscle mass, it's really important that we ensure they have adequate levels of lysine because it's one of our building blocks. So we need to have sufficient of that in the diet. And then also things further down the list like your copper, your zinc, your selenium are commonly lacking in our UK pastures and forages. That can be easily rectified. So in the ration on the right, I've simply added in the recommended amount of a Performance Plus balancer from our range to balance that ration, and that does so quite nicely, and you can see that everything's in green. Not everything matches up to that 100% kind of red line on there, but we're not so worried about that as long as everything is generally around that area and in balance. So that ration is then much improved. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that actually there are kind of differences between the types of feeds that we kind of might choose to balance a ration. And it's important to bear that in mind. And that's why it's worth speaking to feed companies like us, because we know our products, we know kind of what they're suitable for. So it may be strange that actually on this kind of slide here, I've got kind of our Performance Plus balancer, for example, and you might be thinking, well, why am I recommending a performance product for veteran horses and ponies that may no longer be working? And the reason is because these types of products are kind of higher specification, so you've got more nutrition from them. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the difference between a feed, a balancer and a supplement, and when you might use one or the other. So something like Healthy Tummy that I recommended for Ella, that's fed in much larger amounts. If you look at the top line, the recommended feeding rate for a 500 kilo horse is 2.5 kilos, whereas for a balancer, it's only 500 grams, and for a supplement, it's 60 grams. Balancers and supplements are really useful because you get the nutrition in much smaller amounts of feed, which can be great if you've got a horse that is a good doer, or can be great if you've got a horse that's currently not eating very much and you still want to get the good nutrients in. The other key figure to look at is the lysine supplied by the feeding rate. So 17.5 grams for the Healthy Tummy to 12.5 for the performance, and then much lower levels in the supplement. So you can see one of the clear differences there between the kind of supplement and the balancer is the amount of good quality protein provided. So again, for horses that are either on restricted rations or perhaps are struggling with kind of their muscle loss as well, we definitely want to be ensuring that they have this additional good quality protein supplied in their diet. So the difference between your supplement and your balancer is that generally your feed balancer, which tends to be pelleted, will supply that additional lysine, whereas a powder vitamin and mineral supplement like the Performance Vits and Mins doesn't contain that higher level. It just simply gives you your vitamins and minerals. And then obviously the other difference between them is the calories. So if you need the calories, Healthy Tummy at the recommended quantity will give you those. But again, a balancer is a much more restricted amount of energy. So generally we would use things like Healthy Tummy for the poor doer that needed lots more calories in its diet. The balancer would perhaps be using if we're not feeding the recommended amount of Healthy Tummy. But for something that still needed, it was either on a restricted diet or had lost muscle mass. And then the Performance Vits and Mins would be more so for the horse that's on plenty of grazing and forage, and we're just looking to balance the forage-based diet. I hope that makes sense. So in terms of what Kizzy eats in her regime, she doesn't have any access to grass. Unfortunately, it's something we've tried, but she is just too prone to laminitis. So whereas historically she has gone in restricted areas, she's worn grazing muzzles, we're no longer able to do that. And I'm at a fantastic yard that actually built me a wood chip paddock when they were making some amendments to other grass areas, and that's been an absolute saviour having that available. So her diet is largely made up of soaked hay. It is tested, so I do know it's largely appropriate for her, and I just soak as an extra kind of measure because that seems to be most appropriate and work well for her. And that hay portion is actually split into 5 kind of portions across the day, so 1 overnight and 4 during the daytime. And again, I'm really lucky because I'm at a fantastic yard that's able to do that for me whilst I am at work. Because of her diastema, Kizzy has alpha beet soaked to a mash, and then she has the performance vitamins as a supplement and some linseed as well. And generally she has done really well on that. But I've had a bit of drama this week with her because on Sunday night she didn't eat her overnight hay ration, which was hugely concerning to me because she normally gobbles everything up, no problem at all. And actually it transpires that she has fractured a tooth, which she is now having removed tomorrow. So in the meantime, I've actually now been increasing the amount of kind of hay replacer alternatives as she wasn't wanting to eat her hay, which ties quite nicely onto Claire's presentation next, where she will tell us all about that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. I'll hand over, Claire, if you want to take control, and I'll make it try and make it approved. There we go. So over to you.
Okay, super. Thank you, Tracy. That's led in really nicely. I'm going to talk a bit about feeding the veteran horse with dental problems. And poor dentition is certainly a growing concern amongst owners of veteran horses. I think we're seeing them, as Katie said, living much longer and sort of outliving their teeth, so to say. And we've seen this on our feed line. In 2020, we actually received 5 times more calls about forage replacers than we did in 2015. So I think that just shows the level of concern and interest amongst owners. I'm going to give you hopefully some a bit more information about how to use a hay replacer, and I'm going to introduce these 3 horses, Derma, Porthos and Ross, and explain how they're managed despite all 3 of them having dental problems. So the first thing to think about is what signs you need to look out for if you have a horse with poor dentition. And these signs are not always easy to spot, which may mean as horse owners, we have to play at being the detective when monitoring our horses. You may find it takes your horse longer to eat, and this may be its bucket feed, but also it could be that he's taking longer to eat the forage, perhaps not getting to the end of it overnight where he normally would. Another sign would be a horse quidding or dropping up chewed feed. And the picture on this slide is from a field where the pony, actually Ross, which I will introduce you to in a bit, has been struggling to eat the grass. So he's been quidding the grass. And if you look at the field from the gate, this was not obvious, but on closer inspection, we can see that he's been struggling, and there were lots of sort of piles spread around the field where he's not been able to chew it efficiently or sufficiently to be able to swallow it. You may find that horses with dental problems have repeated episodes of choke, and this is likely if they've got, if they're not chewing their food properly, they will have larger food particles passing into the esophagus that are more likely to get stuck and causing issues. So if you're seeing problems with choke, particularly in an older horse, although this would be the same with any horse, we would recommend that you're getting their teeth checked to see if there's something going on that's causing them a problem. You may see longer pieces of fibre in their droppings. So something to watch out for when you're poo picking, actually have a bit of an investigation into the droppings to see what's going on, but larger, longer pieces of fibre are an indication that they're not chewing it as well. And all of these things added together can lead to weight loss. So again, something to keep an eye on. And one of the biggest mistakes I see with elderly horses is owners that are using lots of high calorie concentrate feeds with little success. And often, I think, as Katie sort of alluded to in her part of the talk, that the real problem is that they're not able to chew their fibre properly. And because this amounts to such a large proportion of what they're eating, that they're not able to chew and therefore digest that properly, that this is actually the problem. And the key for these horses is to provide them with the fibre in a form that they can manage. So when we're looking at alternative forages for these horses with poor dentition, I think the first thing we would look to do is to replace that forage with a shorter chopped fibre, which will be easier for them to chew than hay. But a chopped fibre will help to keep them occupied for longer. And I know this is a problem with sort of older horses where we're replacing their forage, that they can sometimes eat it much more quickly, and it becomes a challenge in terms of keeping these horses occupied. So a short chopped fibre should keep them chewing for longer than, for example, a soaked product. The problem with these types of feeds is you can't put them into a hay net to slow them down. So whereas you might use small hold hay nets with your hay or haylage, this is not going to be very useful when you're using a short chopped fibre. But using things like a heavy ball in the bucket that you can put on top of the feed means they have to move it around to get to the food underneath, can be helpful. Also, you could, if they're fairly tidy, if they're perhaps indoors in a stable, then you can spread this maybe around the stable, or multiple forage feeding stations can be helpful. We recommend using chopped alfalfa, grass and straw blends, and these can be used as a complete hay replacer. We're looking for products that are similar in nutritional value to hay. So products like our Hi-Fi Light for the good doer can be really useful because it will be lower in calorie. Or if you've got a horse that doesn't hold his weight so well, then Hi-Fi Senior will be more nutritious and actually is normally a little bit softer, so is quite useful for these older horses. For some horses, though, even a short chopped fibre is not they can't manage, and for these horses we'd look to use a soaked fibre. So grass, alfalfa and sugar beet pellets can all be soaked to make an easy to eat mash. We might also want to look at using some high fibre cubes that will contain other perhaps lower calorie fibre options if you've got horses or ponies that are quite good doers, and all of these can be soaked down, and quite often a combination of all of these can be useful. So when we're looking at how much to feed, I think the first thing we'd look to do is to replace the hay that the horse would normally get on a weight for weight basis. But as a minimum, we would be aiming to feed 1.5% of the horse's body weight. So knowing how much they weigh is going to be a good start, so that you can make sure that you're providing enough. And when we're looking at the percentage of the body weight, 1.5%, this is on a dry matter basis daily. Now, if they do get access to pasture and they are able to eat it, then this will come out of this sort of amount. So something to bear in mind, how much access to sort of fibre, pasture they have when they're outside, if they're outside getting grass. So for a 500 kilo horse, we would be aiming to feed a minimum of 7.5 kilos of fibre per day on a dry matter basis. And this amounts to about 8.5 kilos as fed. Assuming that it's not a haylage where there's a much higher moisture content. But if we can look at the pictures, I've given you some, oh, we've jumped forward a slide, thank you. If we look at these pictures, I've given you some sort of weights just to give you some ideas of how much you need to be giving if you're replacing the hay. So an average section of hay would weigh about 2 kilos. If we compare that to these hay replacements, we've got a scoop of a chopped fibre that weighs about 300 grams. So we need just under 7 scoops to replace that section of hay. In a tub trug, that chopped fibre is about 1 kilo. That's a medium-sized tub trug that was about 20, I think it was about 26 litres, to give you an idea. If we're using a pelleted feed, this will be much denser. So a stub scoop weighs about 1.5 to 2 kilos, depending on the density of the forage that you're using. Okay, so moving on to introduce these horses in a bit more detail. So first up, we have Derma, and Derma belongs to Katie Evans, who works on our feed line, and this is her 20-year-old Connemara. He's about 14.2, and he lives a very active lifestyle. Katie rides side saddle, so she does showing and dressage with him, as well as some hunting and the occasional charity race and other various things that she gets involved in. Derma has poor dentition, and he has had 3 teeth removed. So we can see Katie with one of his teeth in her hand there in the picture. But he struggles to chew hay effectively, and it means he's very slow when he's eating it. So he only normally consumes about 2 kilos overnight. He does get turned out to grass in the daytime, which he manages quite well. But depending on the texture of the hay, if it's quite soft, I think he manages it a bit better. But Katie's been using a partial forage replacer to top up that hay ration to make sure that Derma is getting enough fibre. So he gets fed as part of his bucket feed. He gets our Healthy Hooves molasses free, and he's fed 2 kilos of that each day. And then in addition to that, he gets the Hi-Fi Light, which will be used and adjusted depending on how well he's managing the hay that he gets. And the Hi-Fi Light, normally he's getting around about 2 kilos sort of in addition. So about 7 of those round scoops he's getting in addition to the hay to top up his fibre part of the ration. And as I was saying, it's difficult with these horses where we're using hay replacers in terms of keeping them occupied for longer. And I think this multiple forage feeding, if they can manage some hay, works quite well because he's got some sort of options that will last longer in his stable when he's inside. So next up we have Ross. And sorry, it's just trying to get it started. There's a little video here of him with his hay replacer. So Ross is 37 years old. He's a Welsh Section A. And he has very worn teeth. So I think he does actually have all of his teeth still, but they're very worn, which means that he quids long stem forages, grass, and short chopped fibres. So we can't really manage any of those. He does have a little bit of a pick on some hay, but eats very little of it. And you've seen his the picture of the field where he's turned out. So he does have access to some grass, and he does have a chew of some grass whilst he's turned out, but I think he manages to actually swallow very little of that, which means that we've got to provide all of his allocation, fibre allocation as a hay replacer. So he gets a combination of alpha beet, grass pellets and some high fibre cubes, and this amounts to 4 kilos, which are split into 4 meals per day. So the idea is, again, we want to make this spread this out throughout the day, so that we are reducing the time that he is without anything to eat. And again, we could look at using something to put in the bucket to slow him down with his eating, to make that bucket last longer if he was eating it too quickly. As I say, luckily for Ross, he lives sort of free range, so he has access to grass at the moment, sort of all day long and overnight, which means that he is at least having a munch and keeping himself occupied sort of in between his bucket feeds. And the last horse I want to introduce you to is actually my horse, Porthos. He's 24 years old and is retired. And in June this year, he moved to a retirement livery where he lives in a herd with 6 other elderly sort of horses. He has diastemas that can affect his ability to eat. And he has to have regular sort of dental checkups to help manage those. So we'll have those sort of gaps between his teeth cleaned out sort of 2 or 3 times a year. And he has managed really, really well since moving on the grass. He finds that easier. And as you can see, the picture at the top of the page was taken in sort of June, July time, where he's doing really well weight-wise. There's lots of grass available. And yeah, we're quite pleased with how he was managing. As it's got colder and the grass has not been growing so well, the grass has become a little bit lower, and the yard have provided hay for these horses, and he does manage some hay. So you can see in the bottom picture he is eating some, but you tend to find if the others are at the hay station, he'll be off grazing. I'm not quite sure whether it's herd dynamics that stop him eating it, or whether his teeth are causing more of a problem, and it's something I'll be keeping an eye on. But because he's dropped weight, I have introduced a bucket feed, so he is removed from the pasture and he comes out and has a feed with some soaked alpha beet and grass pellets and a vitamin and mineral supplement to top up his fibre and increase the calories that he's getting. The other thing that I have done is popped a rug on him to keep him warm as it's got colder. Although he has got quite a thick coat, I think that's something that certainly helped. He had started to drop off some weight, and increasing his feed, popping a rug on has worked quite well. And I think the challenge is when you've got a number of horses living together is how you manage these. So the horse in the picture at the hay station with Porthos actually is doing quite well weight wise. So he was left without a rug for longer until he dropped a little bit more weight, and as it's got colder he is now sort of wearing a rug. So I think it's a challenge when you've got numerous horses with different requirements. So I think Katie spoke about this earlier, but really sort of key to be able to feed these horses individually and top up sort of their fibre as needed. Another way we could manage it is to perhaps fence off an area so they can be segregated to have a bit more of a forage replacement if that was sort of needed. So if his teeth become worse, then that may be something that needs to happen where he can stand for a longer period of time to have some forage replacement. So top tips for when feeding a forage replacement, first of all, is to weigh your forage replacer. As you can see, those short chopped fibres don't weigh, they're very bulky, and they don't weigh very much. So it's important to make sure that you are feeding enough of them. So if you can weigh them out, it means you can be much more accurate in making sure your horse is getting enough. Split the forage into smaller meals, and this is important to make sure that the horses are not going too long without any fibre in their digestive tract. Don't soak too far in advance. Soaked feeds will spoil, particularly in warmer or hot weather. So we want to make sure that they're still sort of clean and safe to feed. So if you can soak them daily, and in very hot weather, maybe even sort of within a few hours of feeding would be best if you can manage it. And the other thing to consider is the height of the hay replacer. So for some horses, if they have got sort of neck arthritis or arthritis in their jaw, then they may find that it's easier to eat if the feed is lifted from off the floor. So if the buckets can be put on something a little bit higher, that might be easier for them.
Thank you, Claire. That's brilliant. And just like to say thank you both to you and Tracy for this evening. Some great case studies, lots of information that I hope everyone's found useful, and been busying away behind the scenes answering the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us. We did better this time than last at keeping a bit more express or concise webinar. So hopefully we've kind of found a balance between length and content. But obviously do get in touch if anybody has any questions. The Feedline team are there. You've met 3/5 of us. There's the other Katie and Polly as well, who are on hand to answer any questions. So thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate you taking time to listen to our webinar. We'll stop it now. Thank you very much. Good night.